even if you're a pain in the ass on committee. And I was like, best get well known I've ever received.
A very constructive pain in the ass. But welcome back. We're really sincerely very glad to have you with us again. So, folks, we have some new people around the table, so I am just going to introduce briefly. We have Jean-Luc Plourde, who's with us as our new clerk, and he's very experienced, was on finance. He survived finance, so surely he can survive our NNR. We have Laura, our amazing analyst. Joining us is Avalon, who's going to be assisting with analyst duties and helping write our reports. And Naaman, I think, is just joining us for a few meetings. So welcome all, and we're going to get right into it. I've already called the meeting to order. Like to do, as I always do, acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And before we begin, I would like to ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents. We have amazing interpreters, as you know, and we want to protect their health and safety and the health and safety of all participants. So today's meeting, as you know, is taking place in hybrid format, and I would like to remind participants of the following points. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you. And for those participating by video conference, do we have any by video conference today? Nope. So that is redundant. So I will just move on to pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted Thursday, December 4th, 2025, the committee shall resume its study of the management of Canadian nuclear laboratories by U.S. companies. And I would like to welcome our witnesses. We have with us as an individual, and I hope I pronounced this properly, Christian Leuprecht, Professor, Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University. Welcome, sir. And from the Ottawa River Institute, Ole Hendrickson, who is the president of the Institute. And you will each have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open the floor to questions. Mr. Hendrickson, we're going to start with you. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to appear as a witness. The government-owned, contractor-operated, or GOCO, model for managing AECL's nuclear assets and asset retirement obligations creates major risks: ballooning tax expenditures, an ever-growing nuclear liability, poor waste disposal projects, and public health risks. These risks increase when AECL's responsibilities are contracted to U.S. corporations with little Canadian experience. In 2015, the former AECL subsidiary, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, or CNL, was sold to a U.S.-led consortium for $1. That was the final act of restructuring AECL. The stated rationale was that private sector rigor and expertise would reduce AECL's nuclear liability and operating costs, but this did not happen. Last year, as total AECL funding went from $1.59 to $1.95 billion, AECL's asset retirement obligations, that's the decommissioning liability, went from $8.7 to $9.5 billion. Parliamentary e-petition 6636, signed by nearly 2,500 Canadians, noted that AECL's performance under the GOCO model was never audited. It called for an independent, objective, and systematic assessment by the Auditor General of Canada and asked that any new contract be delayed until audit results were made public and discussed by Parliament. This also did not happen. NRCan Minister Tim Hodgson replied that AECL's performance under the GOCO model was part of a special examination conducted by the Auditor General in 2017, and a subsequent special examination is slated for 2026-27. The 2017 audit occurred only 1 year after restructuring, when AECL had not yet evaluated the contractor's performance with respect to annual earnable awards. The audit found AECL had no formal systematic process for monitoring and reporting on risks, and that AECL's reporting framework could not measure the overall objectives of restructuring, which were to enhance efficiency and effectiveness and to contain and reduce costs and risks for Canadians over time. So do these weaknesses persist? How were fee awards issued during the previous contract? What are the award provisions in the new contract? Has the committee seen it? Richard Sexton, an American with ties to members of the previous contracting corporation, was AECL's president during most of the previous contract. He served as fee determination officer, and another American, David Hess, joined AECL as lead contracting officer in April 2015. He is shown today in LinkedIn as managing the multi-billion-dollar cost reimbursement contracts and agreements governing the contractor's activities, and as holding unlimited contracting authority. AECL is building an advanced nuclear materials research center without a regulatory hearing or other form of government oversight. It would allow training and experimentation in handling of plutonium, the key element in nuclear weapons. Benefits to Canadians are questionable, but obvious for American members of Nuclear Laboratory Partners of Canada, all of whom manage U.S. nuclear weapons facilities. Radiation's health risks make managing nuclear waste far more expensive than other waste. American contractors have an ever-growing guaranteed revenue stream if AECL's waste remains in storage or is put in above-ground facilities such as the proposed NSDF, where it would require centuries of institutional control and monitoring. They have no incentive to examine safer in-ground facilities. And by insisting on a permanent facility at AECL's Chalk River Laboratories on the Ottawa River, the American contractors are ignoring geological and biophysical limitations of that location. Their experience with waste management in arid U.S. environments is not transferable to an earthquake-prone area next to a river providing drinking water for millions of Canadians. When American managers arrived in 2015, they discarded existing long-term waste management plans.
Yeah, Mr. Hendrickson, we're going to have to ask you to fish up. You're over time.
The GOCO model has not worked. It has not delivered cost savings. The Government of Canada should manage its own nuclear decommissioning and radioactive waste activities.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And we're now over to you, Mr. Luprecht. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly.
Monsieur le Président, les membres du comité, je vous remercie de...
Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you for your presentation. I will give my presentation in English, but you can ask me a question in the language of your choice.
Aside, and that the report that this committee is going to write is incredibly important, because what this is about the legislative branch holding the executive to account. Because the basic principle of Westminster parliamentary system here, which is ministerial responsibility, has failed us. You've already heard AECL is not being held to account. It was not held to account by its board, and it was not held to account by the minister. And I will try to explain to you why I think this is what happened here is absolutely unacceptable and reflects the cognitive dissonance that we have in this town, where we talk about diversifying and protecting Canadian sovereignty, and yet then we sell the crown jewels and give the crown jewels effectively over to Americans to manage and to contract. The CNL contract that is subject of this meeting was not competitive. As you heard in previous testimony, there was a single bidder. Awarding a seemingly uncompetitive bid to a U.S. consortium with no actual Canadian participation raises questions about the way the bid itself was structured and the way CNL is structured. That cognitive dissonance at a time when the government is making a big deal about diversification raises 4 concerns: value for money, sovereignty, national security, and accountability. Instead of swapping out management, when we went to the GOCO structure, the new structure simply created a new layer of management. And so now instead of 1 layer of management, there are now 3 layers of management: CNL, AACL, and the contractor, NLPC. Now, that's efficiency the Canadian way. At the time of the first GOCO contract in 2015, 2 of the companies that made up the consortium were Canadian. All companies that are now part of the consortium are U.S.-owned. Nordion and Kinetrix have since been acquired by U.S. entities. Some of these companies are direct competitors to CNL because Kinetrix and BDWX do the same work that CNL bids on. These companies earn far more from their U.S. operations than they do from the CNL contract. Where do their loyalties lie? Online testimony suggests that CNL contract priorities over the last 10 years were driven by maximizing profitability of the U.S.-led GOCO, not what was best for Canada. At the stake in the new contract are administrative barriers to be put in place by CNL to avoid conflicts of interest and access by contractors to intellectual property held by CNL. Those barriers are largely dependent on cybersecurity and information management. Given that Canada has no cybersecurity legislation for critical infrastructure, contrary to Mr. Dermaker's previous testimony to this committee, my level of confidence in any such barriers, let alone their effectiveness, is very low. By way of example, the first regulations on cybersecurity for nuclear were only introduced in late 2025. There's also a broader strategic issue with American companies managing the direction of CNL, since the contract effectively reduces CNL to a service provider. The contractor sets priority, decides who controls IP, whose industrial base benefits from Canadian public investments, basically telling CNL what work to do and what work not to do. Currently, there's a quasi-race to design, construct, and build secure supply chains for small nuclear reactors. Ontario is spending $1 billion on small modular reactors. Moreover, defense applications are part of Canada's SMR action plan. National Defence is looking at a subset of SMRs known as micromodular reactors for use in the Arctic and some bases. When the U.S. political executive is keenly interested in the Arctic and threatening to annex Canada, does Canada really want U.S. companies to have access to dual-use IP and proprietary strategic Canadian nuclear information, such as what, when, and where Canada might place CMRs in the north? Would that not be detrimental to Canadian national security? Government purports its intent is to protect Canadian sovereignty, yet it allows foreign actors to set strategic direction at Canada's only national nuclear laboratory. In awarding the CNL contract, AACL made an economic decision that considers neither national security nor sovereignty. The bid was only reviewed by AACL and its government-appointed board. There appears to have been no external review or accountability for the way AACL awarded the contract, had the bid not gone through, that would have jeopardized AACL's existence and the jobs of AACL management. This bidding process, in my view, was neither fair nor accountable. What needs to happen? 6 points. Conduct an independent threat and risk assessment of the contract. This assessment should be carried out by not by a government agency, but by an independent third party that is completely unbiased. Second, conduct an economic review on whether the labs actually operated any more efficiently under the previous contract to see if there were real cost savings. By going from 1 layer of management to 3, I would venture to guess no cost savings. If that turns out to be the case, then fold AACL, turn CNL back into a Crown corporation, thereby eliminating triple layers of executive management. Hire new management at CNL based on clear metrics of competency, KPIs, and accountability. The UK tried the GOCO model and has reverted to the previous model. We can learn from our allies. Fourth, establish a new accountability structure, different from the GOCO model. To be sure, there were inefficiencies, but as the UK shows, a GOCO is not the only solution. 5, this matter reflects broader systematic issues with government accountability. Why is Enercan only getting involved now after AECL was effectively unaccountable for the last 10 years? Who holds AECL to account? The fact that Elizabeth May raised the issue shows a continuity in the executive's disregard for ministerial accountability. And 6, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has the same problem, no accountability.
Thank you. Gave you a little extra time there, Mr. Luprick, and we will now go on to questions. We're going to start with Mr. Tucker for 6 minutes. Mr. Tucker.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Given that this is over $1 billion a year contract, is it even remotely reasonable to foster all the blame on AECL for the single bidder contract to the all-American firms?
No, that ACL is not solely.
We've got limited to time. Mr. Luprick?
Okay.
So can you reformulate your question?
So is this solely to blame on AECL? Obviously not. This is the line that the government's giving us, is that it's all AECL. It's got to be some accountability here within government. Would you agree?
I think this is my broader point about ministerial accountability. When we cut out effectively all Canadian content and all Canadian players from this contract, that to me, in especially the time that we live in, is not acceptable.
Created red flags with all the climate about the concerns about our neighbors to the south?
It is, look, I sit on 2 boards, one of which I chair. That this did not raise flags with the board and with especially the chair of the board, to me is stunning. That it then did not raise flags with the minister's office suggests to me that we didn't pay close attention to what was actually happening and that we sold a good story and a good narrative.
And just playing out on what the negative, having this all-American group take over their labs, can you walk us through an example of that going terribly bad? We've heard from other whistleblowers the concern of secrets or international agreements that, American agreements that they have to share some of those secrets that they may obtain at our nuclear labs.
This is a fascinating question. In November, we had a round with about 100 IP lawyers in Quebec. They run a fantastic initiative about how this country effectively gives away free IP, going back to the Avro Arrow, but this is what we're observing. Look at the investments we've already made in the F-35, the investments in, for instance, like the German-Norwegian consortium. So the way we structure our IP, whether it's in research or the way we operate critical infrastructure, is not strategic in terms of making sure it stays in Canada, which is why I'm so concerned that the safeguards that the executive at AECL talks about, I do not believe will actually be effective, because I'm not sure that they actually understand how readily they can be circumvented.
And how do you square this circle? We've heard a lot in the media about the defense industrial strategy from the government, and then they go ahead and give control over nuclear ops to an all-American group. Square that for me, or how can you possibly square that, or how could they?
So it is ultimately up to the duly legitimately elected government of the day to set priorities. My concern is that this deal illustrates priorities that are entirely driven by economics.
Do you think it's a concern that our Prime Minister owns shares in one of these companies? Is that a part of the missing piece of it?
I think it is always problematic when because conflict of interest is not just, if you look at the definition in the government of Canada, is not just material conflict of interest, pecuniary, but perception of a conflict of interest. And this clearly creates a perception of a conflict of interest in the eyes of Canadians.
So that the ownership of shares in that company is the perceived. So a remedy would be for him to divest these shares. Would that make this go away then?
We have commissioners and agents of Parliament that are tasked with ensuring that those divestments are done in a way that is compliant with policy and procedure. So it is not for me to comment. But I think we need to be much more rigorous in this country at avoiding perceptions of conflict of interest. It is great that we can attract talent, such as the current Prime Minister, as members of Parliament, but then that talent also needs to make sure that they avoid any such perception of conflict of interest, because that will undermine precisely the independence that we expect of our executive.
And you're talking about the executives at AECL and the Canadian Nuclear Labs. We hear that some of these managers are making over $500,000 a year. Is that accurate?
I skipped that part in respect to the chair of the committee to stick to my five minutes here. But look, 2025 ATIP shows that 9 AECL executives earned $722,000 a year, including travel. Most were not Canadian. By fiscal 23-24, AECL's 11 senior executives averaged over $500,000 each, and 28 senior contractors, of which I believe 27 out of 28, but I would need to check, it's in the ATIP, were American, earned $377,275 a year. That is more than the annual salary of the Prime Minister.
See, I'm sorry, back this up. I didn't realize these are Americans then. Americans are making at AC, like who's paying for them then?
The ATIP is linked to my my opening statement, so you'll be able to refer to the ATIP for the details.
Okay.
Yep. Mr. Tucker, you got 10 seconds. So,
Just to summarize, is this good value for money right now? And these large salaries that are going to go to the Americans?
quick answer.
Without an independent assessment by a third party, we will never be able to tell.
Thank you. Well, thank you both, and we're going to move on to Mr. Hogan for 6 minutes. Mr. Hogan.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for being here. Really appreciated your comments. I've got two lines of questioning. I'm going to throw them both on the table, and then I'm just going to jump into them just so you get a sense. First is the overall GOCO model, as you were talking about. When it was brought in by the Harper government, and it seemed when we were discussing it last time to be a pretty reasonable way to get American expertise, it was described to us as one of the goals was to access American expertise and make sure that we were able to benefit from it as Canadians. I want to explore that, but I also want to throw on the table, it does feel like in terms of the security risk, we're going to need as a committee and as a government to reconcile how we feel about the United States in this matter, because it's personally hard for me to imagine that the United States would not know details about modular reactors in the north under our current security regime. Like it seems actually impossible to me. And I'm not passing moral judgment on whether that's good or bad, but that's something certainly that needs to be reconciled as we think about the overall trajectory of this country and the way that security relationships are evolving. So I guess my question, and I'm going to put it to you, Mr. Leprecht, is what is your sense of the testimony we heard about the GOCO being used to access private expertise, the original policy intent of the Harper government, how much it aligns with that intent, and whether it has provided some value in that sense, or if you just want to expand on your comments in that space?
All I'm suggesting is then when you have a single bidder, and that is entirely American, that is not an opportunity for either ACL or the board or the minister to assess the best opportunities that are out there for Canada to maximize its interests in the current environment. And that I would urge the committee to look at the way that bid was structured, and that having only a single bidder with no real Canadian content, that should have been a red flag in terms of the competitiveness. We have lots of expertise in allied and partner countries. Look at Japan, look at several European countries. And we have, of course, we had Canadian content as part of the previous consortium in Reles Atkins. And there might be an interesting question about, like, why is it that that was not part? I would also say in terms of, yes, the U.S., I would say, would already have access to that SMR, to those SMR details, because if you look at the scientific advisory board, which costs taxpayers $184,000 in 2022. Anyways, it's linked in my it's linked in my the cost is linked in my remarks. For 5 individuals. First, I mean, I work at a university. There's no advisory board that I know of at a Canadian university that costs $185,000 a year for, I believe, 7 individuals. So first, I think there's some interesting questions. Second, one of the members of that advisory board has close ties to the U.S. security intelligence establishment. So yes, if we want to give away all of our intellectual property and make sure the Americans know everything that we're doing, then we might as well put the SNI establishment right on our scientific advisory board.
And so we'll get back to that because I do want to talk about the security conversations. But you said in your comments, CNL decides who controls IP. Can you expand on that, what you meant by that? And
So I think the IP conversation is a longer conversation, and I'm happy to refer you to some excellent material on this. Senator Deakin was also involved in that conversation. He might have some interesting things to say to this committee on that. But we are not very good in this country demonstrably in the way we write our IP contracts. And as a result, we're effectively giving away free IP in our research and development to the United States and to Japan.
For sure.
And of course, we're having it stolen by China.
That is a topic I think that we need to strengthen IP. But in this specific case, when you said CNL decides who controls IP, I'm just trying to understand exactly what was meant by that.
So there's strategic direction in terms of what IP you're going to develop, and then there's the question about how are you going to protect that IP? How are you going to protect both the knowledge component of the IP, and how are you going to protect that IP being used by allies and by partners?
Right. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to badger this point, but my understanding was under the AECL contracts, the IP was maintained and controlled by Canadians. So if we're going to dig into this, I need to understand specifically what was meant by CNL controlling IP.
So I think CNL and AECL should be testifying to the details of that. As I pointed out I can only conjecture, but from what I know about cybersecurity, and as a co-director of the cybersecurity program at RMC that trains some of our highest skilled operators in this country, I have some confidence, I have some understanding of cybersecurity and cybersecurity regulations, and that those are nowhere near stringent enough, and that information management, we simply do not have the regulations, the legislation, and the rigor in place generally for our critical infrastructure, from which I infer that we are not imposing sufficient conditions on this contract, and that we cannot take the AECL executive by their word when they say, don't worry, nothing to see here.
This would be more about the risk of theft than it is like a policy control.
No, it is the risk of inadvertently, by the way we write our contracts, because we are not rigorous in the way we write our contracts, that our allies and partners are benefiting from the IP that the Canadian taxpayer invests in, because we're effectively giving it away for free because we're so not careful about how we write that. Then there's the broader risk of it leaking out beyond the controls, the rigorous controls that we would need to put in place. And as I say...
Thank you. Thank you both. And we are now going to move on to Monsieur Simard. 6 minutes. Allez-y.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'll speak in French. If you want to take a few moments to put your earpiece in, that's fine. I have to tell you this. Your opening remarks are very worrying. Beyond the fact that what we're often doing here is embarrassing the government, we have to go beyond that. We have to be responsible. Regarding a situation that seems dangerous for 3 reasons, you talked about considerable porousness for the government that will be responsible for nuclear waste management. A loss of sovereignty. One of my colleagues mentioned that secrets around small nuclear reactors are perhaps already known. There's also worry that the expertise we have regarding nuclear and a lack of autonomy in the future if we no longer have the ability to manage our nuclear waste. And to intervene in different aspects of the small nuclear reactors. Please, tell the committee what the government should do in the very short term. There will be a report written up. We're not all nuclear specialists here. So what ought the committee to do in the very short term in order to address the situation? First, regarding economic logic, we know that the technology is never welcome in the United States. Given that the consortium makes more money in the United States instead of Canada, we can infer that they have no international interest to promote Canadian technology. So simply in terms of competitiveness, there's an interest to marginalize Canadian IP, Canadian nuclear IP, and to promote American nuclear technology to the detriment of Canadian technology. And that's simply the economic logic. Thank you. So that means in order to promote Canadian technology, it would be in the hands of that business. They have the expertise. Is that what you're saying? That's part and parcel of the expertise and responsibility chain, because there's only one national nuclear lab in Canada that is managed by a consortium, which is now entirely in American hands. Thank you.
Decommissioning and waste management briefly, because that is the bulk of the money that ACL is receiving in annual appropriations and what is being given to CNL. It's about 2/3 of our annual appropriations. So are we getting access to private sector expertise in that area? And possibly some, but I think after 10 years, that is well established in CNL. And I recall Mr. Luprecht saying, why not return CNL to a Crown corporation? And I think that's a very strong point, that we don't anymore need that private sector expertise. It should be fully incorporated. There have been 100 buildings at Chalk River Laboratories that have been decommissioned now. And so there's lots of expertise in the staff who've done that. So we just can let the Americans go. And in terms of what the committee can do, there is a special examination by the Auditor General coming up in 2026-27. And the committee should make some instructions to the Auditor General saying, let's have a really close look at how well this GOCO has worked.
C'est un enjeu, on a une compétitivité internationale.
International competitiveness ought not to be treated like a small sibling compared to their elder sibling. We must protect our sovereignty and Canadian knowledge. I agree with you. I think what we're experiencing at the moment is a collective wake-up call. We were perhaps naive before regarding the United States. In this context, in the context of the trade war, I'm wondering if there's another way to go where a country would give up part of its nuclear sovereignty to give it up to a foreign private company. Does that exist elsewhere? I know in France there's a lot of nuclear. All over Europe there's a lot of nuclear. Do any other countries give up part of their nuclear sovereignty and allow nuclear waste management to be managed by a different state or a foreign company?
Friends, whether we like it or not. Mais une approche plus pragmatique, ça veut dire donc être plus
The
systématique.
most pragmatic approach is to be more systematic in the domains where the United States are indispensable allies, but we need to safeguard Canadian national interests. Canada is one of the founding G7 members and a medium power on the international scale.
Colleagues, we're going to go on to our second round of questioning. We're going to start with Mrs. Gallant for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to Oli. It's always wonderful to see somebody from the Valley, and thank you for your decades of paying attention to our
environment in the valley. My questions will be for Dr. Luprecht, and the first one is, in your opinion, was the statement of requirements stacked for this consortium to win the contract?
So from what I understand, this was the standard two-part process where there's a pre-qualifying and then there's an actual bid submission. And there were several entities interested, but as we know, we only received one bid. And at that point, we had an option. We could have gone back and rewrote the requirements to ensure we get more bids, or we can just go with that one bid because everything else would have had higher transaction costs and higher friction. We made a choice.
Thank you for answering my question. So if the Americans will essentially be managing CNL, what is the risk of Canadian engineers and scientists getting replaced by Americans?
I mean, look at the executive. It's already happening, Ms. Clement.
The workers on the ground, like in the lab.
So yes, we continue to nurture Canadian talent because that's, I think, what CNL does and CNL does well. But I have a cautious story to tell on that. It's not entirely analogous, but of course, Nortel in its day had the largest numbers of engineers in the private sector in this country and had world-leading intellectual property that was in global demand. And we effectively let China steal it for free, as you know, all public record. And so if we continue on this trajectory, we at least need to have assurance through accountability and third-party review that this contract provides us, in terms of Canadian know-how and personnel, the value in terms of not just money, but national interest that taxpayers are looking for.
So the U.S. ambassador said if Canada doesn't keep its word on the purchase of the F-35s, then NORAD's relationship would change. So you mentioned that the Arctic installations, the microreactors, will be impacted by having U.S.-dominated, U.S.-run CNL. There are Canadian companies who have microreactor submissions. Do you think that the Americans will get preference over Canadians because of that relationship?
Right now, Cheryl, the Global First Power micromodular reactor project at Chalk River has been stalled, and the company that was formerly Ontario Power Generation and Ultrasafe Nuclear has been transferred to another American company, Nano Nuclear, and that project isn't going forward. So we're not seeing much progress on micromodular reactors.
I do know there is a Canadian company, CSMC, Canadian Space Mining Corporation, that seems to have the technology for one. Its founder and CEO is a Canadian, Daniel Sachs. That's why I'm asking if that's at risk. So for the Arctic installations, then you think that will be the case. How can we be assured that we will not have our technology and extension Canadian jobs and the income for CNL compromises? Anything in place that you can see to ensure that our workers there on the ground and Chalk River will be able to maintain their jobs and will not be replaced by American workers?
There is no risk to employment at Chalk River. That is secure for generation after generation because of the decommissioning and waste management responsibilities. And that's where Canadian expertise is also extremely important. So as I mentioned, radioactive waste is very different from other kinds of waste. For example, Toronto spends $500 million on its waste, but we're spending over that much more than that. That's annual, and we're spending. It's just not comparable. So we need those workers in the valley, and they will be there for many generations.
Okay.
That's time, Mrs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Danko, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And Appreciate the witnesses today. This is something that I think is very important for our government in the current context. That, you know, the Prime Minister has been very clear that it is in our national security interest to divest from interests in the United States. That is the trajectory that our government is certainly on. Bringing in new trade alliances around the world. So my question first to Mr. Hendrickson is, you know, I appreciate your attention to the need for, you know, a long-term solution to radioactive waste, to environmental considerations, to First Nations as well. So I'm just wondering, in your experience, in your opinions, what are some of those best practices around the world that Canada can look to and learn from?
One really important thing is to develop a long-term waste management facility for low and intermediate level waste. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization has said that they are going to start a process, but they are not a government agency. They're run by private companies. And this is where I think the government of Canada really needs to step in and take control of that. That is the bulk of the waste. I know everyone focuses on the spent fuel rods, but the low and intermediate level waste, much of which is at AECL facilities, has got to be a priority, and other countries have demonstrated successfully various ways of dealing with that.
Thank you. I'm in Hamilton, and we have, I don't know what you would call it, a micro reactor that's been in operation since 1956. And it's been a critical part of Hamilton's economic infrastructure in the terms of development of radioactive isotopes for medical technology, cancer treatment, that kind of thing. In terms of Canada's strategy for dealing with radioactive waste, how does that tie into the growing industry for medical radioactive isotopes?
You want to go?
Either of you.
Go ahead. Again, it's almost a repeat of my answer to the previous question. We just need a lot of medical isotopes have to be short-lived. You can't inject something into someone's body that's going to be there for a long time, so they decay quickly. But things like molybdenum-99, cobalt-60, those are used widely internationally, and but they still remain fairly radioactive even after their use for, say, killing cancer cells is ended, because they decay over time. So again, you need a strategy to manage those when they're returned back to Canada, Nordion, or whatever.
My daughter is soon to be an engineering grad from McMaster. What a fantastic university, and what a terrific asset the reactor is to the university. The point that you raise is, of course, a question about strategic sovereign assets. We know what happens when we have isotope shortages. And so this is an area where, you know, I'm not inherently against the contract that was issued. The problem is the transparency and accountability on that contract, and whether it provides us exactly the sort of answers to the questions that you are looking for. And we also need to think about the counterfactual, right? If we lose certain capacities in nuclear, think about what happened in Germany when Germany voluntarily decided to get out of nuclear. What that did to the cost of living, what that did in terms of productivity, innovation, and prosperity to Germany, and the amount of regret there is today. So we need to be very clear whether deliberately or inadvertently we may be giving up critical sovereign capacities that we'll regret giving up some years down the road, and that'll be very difficult or impossible to get back.
Thank you. I think I'm probably close to time.
30 seconds.
If I can just summarize, both of you are also advocating for bringing the maintenance and operations in-house, you know, to be run publicly. Am I hearing that correctly?
It's impossible to tell if we don't actually have a third-party assessment of the costs and benefits of doing so, economically, security-wise, and in terms of sovereignty. That's why I encourage a third-party outside assessment.
Thank you both. Mr. Simard for 2.5 minutes.
Merci. Je voudrais juste voir avec vous pour très bien comprendre.
From what I understand, when we attribute this kind of contract to a subcontractor, can you change that subcontractor after 3 years? Can you say they don't meet our expectations and decide to find another subcontractor? According to you, will Canada be linked to this American company for quite a while, or would it be possible to find a Canadian alternative?
I don't know the contract provisions. I know that it's not a full 20-year contract, but we need to, I think, look closely at when we can get out of this contract and how. And I'm convinced that, yes, Canadians could do the job.
Et bon, soit on décide, on continue avec le contrat, soit on décide...
Either we decide to go on with the contract or get rid of it. It'll cost government money to get rid of the contract, but governments spend money on all kinds of things. If there's a strategic reason or a reason related to sovereignty to get rid of the contract, there are costs and benefits. Should we get rid of it now? Should we let it expire naturally and then find another solution? All that should be taken into account by the committee. Would it be possible to see it in a fractioned way, in a split way? Are there things that definitely should not be in foreign hands? For instance, small nuclear reactors. Should the government sort of chop those things up and separate those into things that strategically must remain in Canadian hands? Mr. Simard, I know one example I have is France. It is unimaginable that France allow the management of nuclear IP to American companies. Thank you.
Monsieur Simard. We're going to go on to Mr. Martel and Mr. Gay, each for 5 minutes, and that'll wrap up this panel. Monsieur Martel, 5 minutes.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Moi, je suis juste curieux.
I'm curious. Canada is a bilingual country, and the lab's website is only available in English, not in French. I'm just curious. Mr. Martel, they're so dedicated to Canadian culture and bilingualism that their website is only in English. That just shows the priorities they have and the respect they have for this country. A nuclear reactor at the Polytechnic, are they going to ask all the students to speak in English with the consortium just because they don't want to respect this country's bilingualism? And if you look at the execs of the consortium, go and see how many of them are bilingual. So there's also a problem of Canadian content. That's part of what we want to protect and value here. If we want to diversify, we have to respect Canadian diversity. That's interesting. I thought the Bloc would ask this question, but I'm happy to have been able to do it. Comment inaudible. There are certain things I'm having a hard time understanding. That's why I'm happy to ask these questions. Canada has world-recognized nuclear expertise. Canada created the CANDUC technology, and we have unique expertise in nuclear. They're also a leader in small nuclear reactors. And you're saying there's no Canadian country that made a submission? According to what's publicly available, there was interest But at the end of the day, there was only one consortium who applied. In my opinion, that raises flags in terms of how the offer was structured and how it wasn't possible to do more to have Canadian interest. In my opinion, we must show that we've done everything possible to ensure Canadians were considered. There's no way to transparently and publicly validate that conclusion. But do you think we need expertise from elsewhere, not from Canada, because Americans are involved? How is it possible? How is it possible that I mentioned the expertise? There are nuclear labs in multiple allied countries that are similar, comparable, perhaps, what we do in Canada. And the only people in the world who are qualified to manage a lab are the Americans? That's a bit surprising. You said that we're not rigorous. That is, the government is not rigorous when we attribute contracts. In your opinion, how would it be possible to be more rigorous when we write up these contracts? Sir, we are in a situation where almost all federal departments are putting budget cuts in place that are very painful. A lot of civil servants are losing their jobs. The government has an obligation to show that this contract has the best money for value in critical infrastructure of this country. And I am not convinced. I'm not convinced, based on the publicly available information, that that's what they've done. The government has an obligation to convince Canadians that, given the current situation, with the current economic climate, that that's the best solution for Canada. How much time do I have?
Thank you very much. And we will wrap up this round with Mr. Gay. 5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I personally worked for a large American multinational. I'm Canadian. I worked with Canadians. We did business in Canada. And my colleagues all had Canadian passports. Very nationalist Canadian. In this current case, if you listened to the testimony from AECL, you would know that the vast majority of those who are working for the consortium are Canadians. Earlier, it was said that that there are multiple clauses regarding the IP, and maybe there ought to be an audit to ensure that the IP regulations are respected. I have trust that Canadians who work for that consortium will act as Canadians. You seem to imply that because one works for an American company, but think, if you're working for a company that's incorporated in Canada, you're working in Canada, you'll send it all to America. That's what I don't understand. You seem very familiar with national structures, given your work as a professor. What worries you? What makes you think that these Canadians working for a company incorporated in Canada could send information to the United States? By the way, we're talking about waste management and decommissioning. We're not talking about nuclear war. We're talking about civil applications of nuclear technology. Please explain where you think these loopholes will arise and why they ought to worry us. Please be specific on what we ought to audit. Because I don't think that the GOCO model, and I'd like to hear you speak to this, often it's easier to tweak based on what we learn than to try and move backward, to backpedal and create a crown corporation. You're saying get back to a crown corporation when the Harper government put the GOCO model in place while trying to reduce costs for Canadians. Please speak to that. So, does it make sense to listen? The effects of this contract ought to have had an evaluation of the GOCO model. Where is the evaluation of the GOCO model? And my two main worries are, one, protection of data, cybersecurity, and ensuring that there is cybersecurity. The first regulations regarding cybersecurity for nuclear technology were only presented at the end of last year. We're late. We're late in terms of nuclear cybersecurity. Moreover, one moment. I'd like to hear you speak about cybersecurity. Are you saying it's a bigger issue regarding all Canadian industries in terms of cybersecurity that goes beyond this consortium? We're late in our regulations, in our legislation, across all critical infrastructure, not just nuclear. You're right. That's one of my worries. The other worry I have is on the management. The management of IP. I also work in contract security. There are all kinds of worries that have been raised by prominent legal experts in this country. There are real problems in the way we write up contracts. Maybe the consortium has a really amazing updated contract. However, we can't take the CEO at their word. We have to be reassured.
Thank you to both of our witnesses for that very stimulating round of dialogue and questions, respectful as well, which we like to see at this committee. So thank you very much on behalf of the committee. And colleagues, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back here at about 12:05 for our next panel. With our second panel. And where do I start here? Welcome back, everyone. We're going to resume the meeting. Welcome our witnesses. We have with us as an individual, Mr. Stephen Aplin. Welcome, Stephen. And Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, Eric Magui, Vice President, Corporate Affairs. I think you may have been both in the room when you heard the rules of the road here. Please address your remarks through the chair, although you may have noticed I'm a little loose on the rules from time to time, just to encourage good dialogue between our members and yourselves. Again, we always try to remain respectful and on point here. So you're each going to have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open the floor to questions. And Mr. Aplin, we're going to start with you. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Thank you for having me as a witness. This is a very consequential parliamentary hearing, possibly the most consequential one that Canada's facing right now, about Chalk River and its coming under American management. Chalk River is the centerpiece of Canada's nuclear history. It's where we became a Tier 1 nuclear nation. All the fundamental research that we did that put us on that map was done at Chalk River. When I say Chalk River, I mean CNL, interchangeable terms. The Cobalt-60, cancer-fighting radioisotope, molybdenum-99, and of course the Canada reactor, which I think it's no exaggeration to say that it's the most consequential invention in Canada's history. It's powering this room as we speak. A lot of people don't know that when all this marvelous research was being done in the early days of Chalk River, the Americans, our one-time friend and neighbor, friend and ally, told us, hold out your hands, we're going to put handcuffs on you. We held out our hands and they slapped the handcuffs on. What am I talking about? They did not want us to enrich uranium in the early days or any time thereafter. They wanted, they said, if you're going to use enriched uranium, which is a fundamental material in nuclear research, we will provide it for you. So no enriched uranium for Canada. We cannot do that on our own soil, and we agreed to it. Why did we agree to it? Because we went along to get along, as per Prime Minister Carney's remarks last week in Davos. They did not want us to enrich uranium, they said, because of some proliferation reason. I think it's bogus. I think that was a smokescreen for a commercial purpose. They did not want us competing against them in the the developing power reactor market. So we went along, and they were worried that we would be a good competitor, and they were right, because as the CANDU proved, we could run circles around them if it was a level playing field. It wasn't a level playing field. We were not allowed to enrich our own uranium. And we still won this game until we got cut off when the country that told us don't enrich uranium because we'll provide you with enriched uranium cut us off from enriched uranium. That was in 2016 under Barack Obama. And Canada at that point, Chalk River at that point, stopped doing major nuclear research. This was we did this, we went along to get along, as Mark Carney said, and this ended up biting us because we ended up, like I said, we ended up getting cut off. And now, who ran Chalk River during this time of wonderful innovation that brought us the radioisotopes and the CANDU reactors? A small federal Crown corporation called Atomic Energy Canada Limited, spun out of National Research Council. Its chairman, its president appeared before this very committee at the end of last year, Fred DeMarker. In his remarks to the committee, Fred DeMarker said, I agree with him. He emphasized that Canada is a Tier 1 nuclear country. We are a Tier 1 nuclear country. I would ask the question, if we're a Tier 1 nuclear country, why do we need another country managing our flagship nuclear lab? We've got a major amount of nuclear research to do that we need enriched uranium for, and that's because we have a major geopolitical problem in our Arctic. We cannot essentially defend our Arctic. That wasn't a big problem under the previous rules-based international order, but that order is gone. The United States, its inventor, has ruptured that new world order. In order to protect our Arctic, Canada needs nuclear-powered devices. We don't have those devices now. We would need to develop them, and we would develop them at Chalk River. The very facility, we're handing Americans control of the very facility that we would need to conduct the fundamental research into protecting our Arctic. We're handing the keys of our nuclear kingdom over to representatives of that country. This is not Alice in Wonderland. This is actual real life. We're handing control over our nuclear kingdom to representatives of that country. Essentially, we're going to pay them with public money to keep their eye on us. And the American executives in charge at NLPC, the company that's going to manage this, are all Q cleared in the United States. They all have top-level clearances. Essentially, they're members of the U.S. intelligence community. They work for a person that Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand don't want to share intelligence with because she is she's a pro-Putin stooge. She works for a president who is a pro-Putin stooge, if you've been following the news, this horrific news out of Ukraine over the last year. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, when we conducted our nuclear research with the handcuffs on over those 8 decades, what did we get in return for it? We got the 51st state. We got Governor Trudeau. We got Governor Carney. We got a trade war by this guy who's mad because Canadians wouldn't stay in his crappy hotel in Vancouver. We should not be turning control of our nuclear flagship, of our nuclear kingdom, to representatives of this country.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are now on to Mr. Magouille, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Je m'appelle Eric McGoy.
My name is Eric McGoy, and I am Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. Born and raised in northwestern Ontario, I have over 20 years of experience working at the intersection of government, energy, and communities. I spent more than a decade in government and another decade in the energy sector, including at Ontario Power Generation and the Ontario Ministry of Energy. In recent years, my work has focused on Indigenous and public engagement for clean energy projects, including supporting new nuclear projects and relationship agreements with Indigenous communities, as well as intergovernmental collaboration on small modular reactor development across Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and New Brunswick.
As Vice President of Public Affairs, I'm responsible for communications and engagement with employees, host communities, stakeholders, and elected officials. and support transparency within the framework established by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited and the Government of Canada. Allow me now to expand on the relationship between CNL and Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. CNL operates Canada's nuclear laboratories on behalf of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited under a government-owned, contractor-operated contract, often referred to as a GOCO. ACL owns the sites, the assets, the liabilities, and the intellectual property. It also sets CNL's mandate and remains accountable to the Government of Canada and to Parliament. CNL's role is to deliver that mandate safely, securely, and effectively in full compliance with Canadian law, Canadian regulators, and ACL's requirements. Our three priorities at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories are as follows: to restore and protect the environment, to advance clean energy today and tomorrow, and to contribute to the health of Canadians. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McGooey. And we will go on to questions. And our first speaker is Mr. Tucker for 6 minutes. Mr. Tucker.
Thank you very much, Chair, and to our witnesses. Mr. Applin, where do the paychecks for the NLPAC staff come from?
They come from the Canadian taxpayer
Through which companies then?
through ACL.
ACL. Now, please explain on the staff that are part of the consortium that's taking over. The CFR 810 and the full legal obligations of U.S. citizens in the NLPC. What do you know of that agreement they have to sign?
I think that they're obliged to turn over what they know to their American employers and to the American government, to DOE. Is my basic knowledge of that. It doesn't go much beyond that.
So the contract is that they have to sign is that they have to share with the U.S. government.
They're obliged to. Yeah, that's correct.
So that under their law, American law,
that's
people
correct.
working at Chalk River will have to do that. So if Donald Trump orders U.S. citizens not to help Canadian develop nuclear technology, will American executives and the American group comply and prevent CNL from doing the research, or will they disobey Donald Trump and their obligations under it? Which one would they do?
That's a rhetorical question. Obviously, he doesn't need this act that you're talking about in order to compel somebody to be loyal to him. Just from what we're seeing, if he wants them to not cooperate with us, they will not cooperate with us.
So there's no way of writing into the contract any outs or loopholes that would protect us?
We could write it in. Does he follow the law? He sends ICE people to Minneapolis.
So even though this contract we haven't seen, and how this committee came together is that for months the government has been stalling, and I'm very grateful that you and our other witnesses are here today. We've had other witnesses that wanted to testify, but seemingly were scared to attend, so I appreciate you being here. Can you unpack, what would it be like to be one of these executives of the American company working at Chalk River, and they would be divided in their loyalties?
Well, the Americans, I'm not sure would be. Well, perhaps they're divided in their loyalties. We don't know. We don't know whether they support the president or not. But I mean, it would be. Like I said, I think it would be a fairly straightforward situation if they were, if anybody in the political realm prevailed upon them to do something that is against Canada's interests, they wouldn't. I think that they would comply with that request, either against their will, but I mean, a lot of people I can't tell whether it's against their will. I can't tell. I know that Congress has got a role in a lot of the things that the president is doing, and the Congress is not taking any action whatsoever. So I think it's kind of a moot point if especially this U.S. president wants something out of those executives that is contrary to Canada's interests, even contrary to the letter of whatever contract they sign, he'll get it.
So how is that Canadian? Like, we've been hearing the news, it's elbows up and we're all rally around the flag, and then we sign on a multi-year billion-dollar contract with the identity that we claim to be buying Canadian, but we're actually buying American here, or selling out to Americans.
Yes, that's precisely what we're doing. I'm amazed that it's January 2026, with all that has happened in this situation that has developed south of the border, particularly since January 2025. I'm amazed that we are blithely walking down this path and doing like we shouldn't have done. My point during my talk was we shouldn't have complied with those requests going back to the 1950s. That was under sane American presidents, the sane American presidents from Eisenhower up to Barack Obama. We shouldn't have done it then. We could have pushed back and should have pushed back. We didn't. I'm not going to cry over spilt milk, but certainly under this president, we should not be doing
And
this contract.
something stinks here, obviously.
Yeah.
And we know that the current Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has shares in one of the companies that is leading this bid, which is another question with it. I have this. But switching gears to our other witness, just talked a little bit about, do you think it's a good idea at this time to let U.S. citizens obligated by the CFR 810 manage nuclear defense-related research in Canada? Mr. McCoy.
So I'm not an expert in the CFR 810. I'm a Canadian citizen. I'm not subject to any of those requirements. And I certainly concede that there's a mixture of people on the executive team from various countries. We have UK citizens, we have a significant number of Canadian citizens, and yes, we have Americans.
Are any other country threatening to take over Canada?
Pardon me?
Are any of those countries threatening to take over Canada? And that's where the rubber meets the road, is that this doesn't match up with the rhetoric, not you, sir, but of the government and the actions of this.
So we are all, so under the terms of the contract, all of us on the executive team have a primary loyalty to Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, period. We then have a secondary loyalty and accountability to Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. In addition, anyone who is an officer of the corporation on the executive team has a fiduciary duty to put the interests of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories first. If they cannot do that, then they should resign.
Yes, but we're not seeing the
to
resigns.
you both. We are at time for your intervention, Mr. Tucker. We're going to go on to Mr. Gay for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McGooey, it's very interesting to watch this discussion here between the conspiracy theorist and independent advisor. You actually work for the corporation, right? Did you sign any paper that you actually would be bound to turn anything away to the Americans?
I did not.
You did not. Did any of your colleagues, to your knowledge?
No.
No. Can you talk to us about what you're doing as a team for Canada?
Absolutely. So it was interesting that Mr. Applin said that he's comfortable using Chalk River and Canadian Nuclear Laboratories interchangeably. And that's a fair point in terms of the future of the organization. If we're looking at 20 years from now, it's very likely that the only site that will continue to be operated by Canadian Nuclear Laboratories is the site at Chalk River. It has a science and technology mission that is going forward for many decades. At the rest of the sites, the mission is, as Mr. Hendrickson said in the previous testimony, decommissioning and waste management. That is to say, we have legacy waste associated with the development of Canada's nuclear sector, of which we're all rightfully proud, to clean up those demonstration reactors, the nuclear project demonstration reactor north of Chalk River, the Douglas Point commercial reactor, demonstration reactor in the Bruce County, and the Gentilly reactor near Bécancour, as well as Whiteshell near Pinawa in Manitoba. All of those reactors need to be safely decommissioned in order to free up the land for future use at those different sites. So in the case of Gentilly 1, that site is owned by Hydro-Québec. We need to restore the land, give it back to Hydro-Québec, so they can use it for whatever priorities matter to them. We'll have different potential uses at the different sites based on engagement with Indigenous nations, local community, and stakeholders, potentially economic development, potentially tourism, recreation, potentially new brownfield sites. It's all going to depend what we can work out in partnership, of course, recognizing that Atomic Energy of Canada Limited owns the land. So if you look at where most of a dollar is spent, for every dollar that we get from AECL, most of it goes to addressing those legacy environmental issues. The rest of what we do is the science and technology mission. And as Canada's National Nuclear Laboratory, anytime the Government of Canada has any questions involving anything nuclear or radioactive, we do that work for you. So if the CNSC wants to know about new limits and look at the human impact of radiation, we would do that work on behalf of the Government of Canada. If we wanted to look at potentially using targeted alpha therapy and radiological medicine, we do that work, as well as, of course, a lot of commercial work supporting the existing CANDU fleet, making sure that we continue to generate emissions-free power across the country.
Mr. McGooey, you actually talked about you and your colleagues, it's a multinational team, right? It
Correct.
Sounds like you, not only Americans, Canadians, you mentioned Brits. Do we benefit as a country from that expertise? And in what way?
I think we do benefit, and I think that there are many questions about the contract itself that are best answered, and in fact were answered by leadership from Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. However, one of the really important ways in which our bids were evaluated, or the bid that I worked on was evaluated, is they wanted Canadian experience in key areas. They wanted subject matter expertise, so decommissioning waste management, science and technology, health and safety, so on. And they wanted GOCO experience. And I think it's really important that we remember there is only one GOCO contract in Canada, this one. Since the incumbents who had the contract for the last 10 years did not come back as a consortium to bid again, that means if you want GOCO experience, you're going to have to look outside of Canada. And so the way the contract was written guaranteed that we were going to have people from outside of Canada who were subject matter experts and could bring that GOCO expertise, while other members of the team, like myself, would be providing the Canadian experience. Although there certainly are some members of the team whose citizenship is American who have very strong Canadian experience. Our Chief Operating Officer, Len Cluett, worked at Bruce Power for many years before being the Chief Nuclear Officer at Sask Power. So he has very strong Canadian experience. Our VP of Construction worked at Chalk River Laboratories earlier in her career. So the idea that to be American is to be incapable of loyalty to CNL is something I reject. I also reject the idea that to be American by citizenship means you can't have Canadian experience. I know that not to be true.
Okay. Thank you both. We are going to move on to Monsieur Simard. 6 minutes. Allez-y.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to disagree with my friend Claude, who I like, but I don't think that this is a conspiracy theory we're talking about. If you told me 2.5 years ago that our relations with the Americans would look at what they look like now, I would have said it was a conspiracy theory. From a geopolitical perspective, or rather, excuse me, can you hear me, Mr. Applin? Maybe, can we just take a moment, please, because I have a question. Thank you. I ought to have started with that.
We've stopped your time, Monsieur Simard.
C'est apprécié. Oui. Donc, vous seriez supposé dans...
So, supposedly you will hear the dulcet tones of the interpreters at the moment. Is that the case? Yes, 1, 2, 3 testing, 1, 2, 3 testing. This is a test. 1, 2, 3 English channel. It doesn't work.
Est-ce que vous entendez?
Does that work? Can you hear? Can you hear the translation?
Technicians, please.
C'est un complot américain.
Okay. This is the interpreter. And now, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. And so now, earlier, I was saying maybe we're not talking about a conspiracy theory because our relationships, we never would have imagined a few years ago that our relationship with the United States would be the way it is now. So I understood in your opening remarks, particularly the parallel you made with uranium enrichment, if I've understood, that was forbidden by the Americans. In the near future, an American company controlling a key part of our nuclear capacity could have impacts on the development of new research avenues, such as waste management. In your opinion, a situation where a foreign company is in charge of everything in the contract, because we haven't seen the contract, we don't know what's in it, what could the effects and the impacts be in the future? Is there a risk that could put the brakes on research? Could there be impacts on waste management? Please speak to that.
As far as research, could it put the brakes on research? Yes, it could. They could. Americans are just in my professional experience with them are not happy that we developed the CANDU. They don't like the CANDU. Raise a number of what I consider to be phony proliferation concerns about it. And would they have all that much interest in pursuing? There's further research that we could do with CANDU. I talked about enriched fuel. If we had slightly enriched fuel with CANDU, there's amazing stuff that we could do with them. Are American competitors essentially interested in seeing us pursue those research avenues? I would say probably not. And you don't need Donald Trump to come to that conclusion. They've never been all that interested. Like the GOCO, I don't know has done all that much interesting research into CANDU at all since it came into inception. So the answer to your question is could they block or halt research that would benefit Canada? Of course they could. I'm not saying that they would. There's just no interest south of the border in our fuel technology, and likely very little interest in anything having to do with waste management.
Merci. Je comprends.
Thank you. Based on what you said, I understand that there is a contract that ensures the way things will be done. And in the Prime Minister's speech in Davos, today, contracts are often subject to higher interests. In your opinion, the kinds of research being done at the moment, you mentioned nuclear medicine. I suppose that there are applications in defense as well regarding the defense of the Canadian North. All those elements must be protected one way or another, I suppose, at the moment. Yes, absolutely. In terms of defense, absolutely. Canada uses nuclear energy. For energy only, and pacifist reasons. Canada does not have nuclear bombs. When we discuss the Canadian defense, as my colleague Mr. Applin said earlier, we're talking about the defense of the Canadian North, small nuclear reactors. Research is underway at the moment. The research touches on different fuels. We talk about triso fuel, which is enriched. That can be used for small nuclear reactors. This would help northern bases or northern communities. Quickly, what really interests me is how that IP is protected and how it is protected. Okay, on many levels. There are laws that control exports. So there's information here in Canada, in IT systems, in the Canadian Nuclear Laboratory, for instance. We are all, included my American colleagues, prohibited from sharing certain information, for instance, on websites or servers. But some of your American colleagues have access to that information, from what I understand. Yes, we have access, and the law is clear, very clear. We cannot...
Mrs. Gallant. Mrs. Gallant, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To both of you, does the contract have any non-competition clauses to ensure that companies in the consortium cannot take the business away from CNL in the future?
Good question. I don't know about non-competition clauses specifically, but there certainly are strong conflict of interest clauses. So, for example, since I was recruited by Kinetrix to be part of their bid, I'm only able to be a CNL executive as a seconded Kinetrix employee. And of course, Kinetrix does compete with CNL for some commercial work on pressure tubes, for example. And as a result, I am expressly prohibited from participating at any level in any of the procurements related to that work. I'm not allowed to see the scope of work that other companies are submitting in the bid process. I'm not allowed to help design the bids. I'm not allowed to evaluate the bids. I'm not allowed to see the bids. So there's very thick ethical walls that prevent me from any involvement. And in fact, the expectation is, in addition to those thick ethical walls on the CNL side, from my Kinetrix reporting relationship, I have a vice president who approves my timesheets, and admin support to help with travel costs and so on. But I am fully seconded to Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. I do not do any work to support Kinetrix on any files since the contract was awarded on December 11th.
Okay, so you mentioned, have you worked federally in government or any political offices?
Provincially, yes. Federally, no.
Okay. You mentioned the conflict of a definite conflict of interest, and our previous witness said there had been the appearance of a conflict of interest because of the ownership of shares by the Prime Minister, who ultimately is responsible for appointing the AECL board. From your knowledge of the ethics procedures, are you subject to any of that?
So, I believe that in the previous testimony on December 11th, Mr. DeMarker and Madame Emilie Paget made it clear that the procurement decisions were made exclusively by AECL and were not subject to political interference.
Okay.
And I take them at their word.
All right. Do you have a pecuniary interest in any of the companies within the consortium?
Other than being paid through one of them through the contract, I do not. I don't own
Okay,
shares.
so you don't
I
own
don't.
shares.
No.
So you don't have any. You don't have any conflicts of interest with respect to your previous employment with provincial ministers?
No, Ontario Power Generation is a provincially owned utility, so it has one shareholder, the province of Ontario. I worked as an independent consultant, so I owned my own business, no shareholders. So I have exchange traded funds and a small pension, but so it's possible that somewhere in there would be holdings in through a mutual fund, through an ETF
fair
that
enough.
would be exchange, but certainly I do not own stocks in any particular company, for
Okay.
example.
Mr. Applin, would it be fair to say that the CNL contract surrenders Canada's lead nuclear powerhouse over to the United States?
That's what I think, yes. I think it's fair to say that, yes.
And from your experience, how do you glean this? What have you done to be able to make that assessment?
Well, because we're these are American companies, and in the situation that we're in today, where there's political pressure being exerted on American companies, you've got American CEOs giving the president gold statues. I think that there's a very good chance that that kind of political pressure could be exerted on the members of this consortium. Why not?
Have you seen examples of that type of surrendering Canadian sovereignty in any other companies that you've worked with?
It's a kind of I work in the nuclear industry, and just from my general observation, I see a I don't want to quote our prime minister. I see a going along to get along attitude with respect to this particular situation of turning Chalk River Labs over to American management.
Thanks. Thank you both. Thank you, Mrs. Gallant. We are going to hear now from Mr. Hogan. 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. This has been a wide-ranging discussion over this and previous conversations on this topic. I want to maybe just pull it back, say, my view, that we've really come to three questions that the committee, the government, Canadians need to tackle with. One is oversight. It's an independent board. It's designed to be arm's length. It is subject to the Auditor General. Doesn't mean government doesn't have a role. The question is the nature of the role. I think that's question one. Certainly as parliamentarians, we have a role. A second question would be the model. It leads to the model, those previous oversight questions. Is GOCO the right model? Should we be exploring Crown models? I understand the policy rationale of the Harper government in creating a GOCO for this. It does seem to me to be designed to pull in the kind of expertise we are now a bit worried about. And so that does, not seem crazy in the current context. And it leads to my third question, which is our relationship with the United States and our comfort with integration of our nuclear systems, our need for their technology, our comfort with maybe provisions and agreements that we've come to in the past. So 3 questions: oversight, model, relationship with the United States. I think, fundamentally, I'm just hoping we can kind of take this whole ball that we've been given and put some framework around it here. But within that, I want to understand a little bit more about the model. So, Mr. McGooey, this is, I think, to you, but we heard from a previous witness, what we've heard from previous witnesses, some contradictory comments about intellectual property. Who controls IP? How is IP established? And how is IP managed by the combination of AECL, CNL, and the vendors who were successful in receiving the contract?
Thank you very much, Mr. Hogan. So I liked your framing of the issue, oversight model, relationship with the United States, and respectfully, that third piece strikes me as a much more philosophical conversation, probably best with some beverages and no live stream. But if you'll excuse me, I'll speak mostly to the first two.
Absolutely.
And so you talk about intellectual property, and I will absolutely go into that. The short answer is Atomic Energy of Canada Limited owns the intellectual property. They licensed the intellectual property for the CANDU technology to SNC-Lavalin. And SNC-Lavalin continues to be the licensee, AECL continues to be the owner, and CNL continues to support the CANDU IP as well as related intellectual property developed by AECL, such as the Slowpoke reactor that we were talking about earlier, the technology that's in Mr. Danko's riding, as well as what that we call the nuclear battery technology. But with your indulgence, Mr. President, I would like to, or Mr. Chair, pardon me, Mr. Président, I would like to just correct the record, because some earlier witnesses made some claims that I just think are not true, and it's not helpful to have those go unaddressed. So, for example, it was said earlier that there's no Canadian content, that the contractor sets the priority, that these companies have no Canadian experience, and these are all American companies. And none of those things are true. When we talk about, I'll go through one by one. So Canadian experience, Amentum, which is one of the three shareholders in NLPC, acquired Jacobs Engineering, which was one of the three companies in the last consortium. So they have 10 years of Canadian experience at CNL through the GOCO because of their acquisition of Jacobs Engineering. Kinetrix, the company that hired me to support them with their bid, was spun off from Ontario Hydro's research division in 1999 and has been operating in the GTA since then. That's where their headquarters is. They have nearly 1,200 employees in Canada supporting the CANDU fleet, doing high voltage transmission work, and supporting CANDU, in fact, across the world with their base of operations in Canada. When I was recruited for this contract, I signed a contract with a Canadian company to do exciting work at Canada's National Nuclear Laboratory. And yes, events have overtaken us in many respects since that time about a year and a half ago.
Yeah,
when I
Mr.
first signed that
Magui,
contract.
you've got 40 seconds, so
Yes, thank you.
You
Finally,
could wrap up your points.
BWXT Canada has over 3,000 employees in Canada. In places like Cambridge and Peterborough, they make nuclear components for CANDU, SMRs, steam generators, heat exchangers, and CANDU fuel pellet fabrication. So to suggest that these are companies that don't have a strong Canadian presence, don't employ thousands of Canadians, and don't have Canadian experience is simply untrue, as is the suggestion that it's CNL that controls
Point of order,
intellectual property.
Chair, but these are all American-owned companies.
Are
they not?
Mr. Tucker, what's your point of order?
Point of order is that, but these are American companies. That's the point.
That
It's
is not a
Canadian.
point of order, Mr. Tucker. Please continue. Just if you want to wrap up on your last point there, Mr. Magui.
I've said my piece. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. That is time, Mr. Hogan. And so, Monsieur Simard,
Merci.
2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. Touching on what you just said, Mr. McGoy, you spoke to certain false declarations by my colleagues. If possible, please respond in writing. You did so orally, and it's a bit hard to wrap our heads around it. So if you could, please respond to those questions in writing and send it to the committee. That can help us with our report. I'd like to speak to a different topic. From what I understand, this committee wrote a report. We received documents from Electricity Canada that showed us different production of megawatts. So hydro, nuclear, and solar with disproportionate cost. And not long ago, I learned of an article that showed the quick development of new Chinese battery technology linked to solar panels. With that technology in 10 or 15 years, won't there be a decline in nuclear? Because it's very, very expensive. Please speak to that, both of you.
Sure. I think it's a myth that nuclear costs are higher than solar costs. It's comparing the two of them is like comparing apples and oranges. One of them provides steady baseload power throughout the day, hundreds of days at a time, at a high power rate, at thousands of megawatts, quite literally for hundreds of days at a time. The other one goes down, stops when the sun goes down, and starts and provides very spotty performance when the sun is up. So the two of them are not comparable when it comes to costs. That's the main thing that I would say, and the idea that nuclear is something that will be kind of gone in the next few years, I just simply disagree with that.
Même avec le déploiement de nouvelles technologies.
Even with new storing technology, you don't think it'll be comparable?
Avec mes excuses, je vais essayer de répondre en...
Excuse me, I'll try and respond in French.
Mr. Applin's absolutely right when he made the distinction between baseload power. So you need your steady, reliable baseload. Hydro is perfect for baseload. Nuclear is perfect for baseload. Then you've got peaking power. And when you've got intermittent power, it needs to be backed up by peaking. That's why as Ontario expanded renewables like solar and wind, it also built a whole bunch of new gas plants. Because while a battery can supply you enough power to keep the electricity flowing when a cloud passes between the sun and your solar panel, it can't provide power overnight when
Thanks.
the sun isn't shining.
Thank
so you need to run peaking plants.
Thank you both. We are now going to go on to our last two speakers, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Danko. 5 minutes each, and then we'll be going into camera.
Thank you, Chair. I have 5 minutes, you said?
Yes.
Okay. Start now. Mr. McCooey, you said that you're here, a nonpartisan role. You said that you work provincially with the Liberals, but no connections with the federal Liberals.
That's correct. I've never worked for the federal Liberals.
So, but on your LinkedIn profile, the new member that just joined our committee, Mrs. Nguyen, is a Liberal, and your LinkedIn account said you volunteered with her.
That's not MP Nguyen. That's a different MP.
But you volunteered with another federal Liberal then?
That's correct, I did, yes.
But you just said you didn't have an association with the Liberals. And where I'm going
I
with
said
this
I
is the
didn't work for
transparency
the
is the
Liberals.
issues. We
Okay,
have
just,
issues with the contract for transparencies.
One at a time.
And you're claiming that we're not
Mr. Tucker's got
associated with that.
Hang
and
on.
it appears that to be not the case. Yeah. We have issues where this contract isn't transparent on a lot of it. So you worked on the bidding process, and you said that the bid, who do you think created the priorities or the parameters of that bid?
Mr. Magoo.
I believe that the parameters of the bid were created by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited.
Would it be the board or executive members?
I presume that the board would have to approve the overall parameters. I don't know whether the board was specifically involved in the design of the procurement itself or whether it delegated that to the executive.
And so the board that was appointed by the Liberals okayed the parameters of this bid that your company won, correct?
I don't know for a fact that they voted. I wouldn't have been at those meetings. Seems reasonable to believe that the board would have provided oversight over the procurement process.
And in your last testimony, you said that this agreement or this proposal was almost guaranteed to go to an all-American group. How was it
Mr.
written?
Toke, please. That is not at all what
You
I
said
said.
it was guaranteed, though, that it would go to someone outside of Canada.
That there would be members on the winning team that had GoCo experience, which likely would have been obtained outside of Canada. Yes, as a portion of the winning bid.
So the bid, the proposal guaranteed that this would go to a foreign company because
No.
it was looking because
No,
the
because, Mr.
requirements.
Toker, I said because the previous consortium that ran CNL from 2015 until 2025 did not opt to make a bid or submit a bid. That is the only, those are the only people in Canada with GoCo experience. I
So
don't
how it
know
was
why
written-
they didn't bid. I don't know why they didn't bid. But because they didn't bid, the GoCo experience
It
that was
automatically went
part
to
of the
the winning
score
bid. I get
was
that.
going to end up
that's how
being
it's
coming from
slanted.
elsewhere.
This is where we had the issues that the contract was awarded underhandedly because it was slanted in favor of the winning bid versus past companies. So back to your earlier testimony
But
about kinetics.
How could the
and-
writers of the bid not have known in advance that the incumbents weren't going to bid again?
This is the problem we had with why we would like to see the contract, the whole bidding process. We've been stonewalled for months.
Pardon, Monsieur le Président.
On this issue.
C'est un très bel échange. J'apprécie beaucoup, mais il n'y a plus de traduction.
Excuse me, there's no more translation. So I can't hear what's going on. I was saying, well, it's a lovely conversation, I appreciate it, but there's been no more translation for a while.
You can, we've stopped your time. One moment.
3 minutes left. Yeah, but it wasn't in French though. So I'd like to start at the top because the translation services cut me because this won't be.
When did the translation?
You said it was
stop?
a while ago.
Just a few seconds.
On va dire ça.
Hearing it to Mr. Tucker.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this goes back to the transparency of this awarding of this contract. We haven't seen the contract itself. The minister hasn't appeared. We know that there's experts in the security field that have rang the bell that this is bad for Canada, bad for our sovereignty. Then we have witnesses that come that claim they have no association with the federal Liberals, but then we find out through their LinkedIn profile that they have volunteered on campaigns in the past. We have jokingly aside said that we'd go for drinks and when the cameras are off and to have that further discussion, which is adds to the issues we have with transparency when we're talking about it would be good to have a conversation when the cameras are off over a beer. And this might be how the Liberals operate in Canada, but I can tell you Canadians are fed up. Fed up with saying one thing and your actions don't match those words. And this is a prime example when we sell out our Canadian nuclear labs to an all-American group that has connections to our Prime Minister. It stinks. And we need more study on this, and I'm very interested to see this report at the end and the recommendations on we should be ripping up this agreement and starting over again.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Thank you, Mr. Magui, and welcome Ms. Chi to the committee, Toronto MP, who's replacing Cory Tucker as we wind down the meeting. So to our final speaker, Mr. Danko, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I think like all of us, I've been doing my genuine best to follow the bouncing ball of the conspiracy theories here this afternoon. I'm not sure. I can't follow. I guess you got to be plugged into those networks to understand what they're talking about. But, you know, Mr. Alpin does make some very valid points about the current U.S. administration, the lack of the rule of law, lack of accountability in the United States under the current White House. It's a fascinating exchange because, like, recent polling shows that 49% of conservatives support the Trump White House. 47% of conservatives would not resist the American annexation of Canadian territory. And there's strong U.S. influence over the Freedom Convoy movement and the opposition leaders' Maple MAGA movements. So it's been a very interesting day. Mr. Magui, I'll go back to you and I'll give you the last word and the last time there. Anything that you wanted to add to set the record straight on the work that you do, the benefits to Canadians, and the overall integrity of your organization.
Sure. So thank you very much, Mr. Danko. So through the chair, I apologize for my glibness earlier about when I referenced having a drink and talking about the Canada-U.S. relationship. It's a very serious issue. We're all impacted in different ways. One of my best friends from high school is in Minneapolis, and we've talked regularly over the past few weeks, and what's happening there is absolutely horrific. And I don't want to suggest that it's not a serious issue, and it's certainly worthy of this committee's interest and hard work. And so I regret having been glib in that respect. In terms of the work that we do at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, we take very seriously our mandate to deliver for Canadians. One of the most interesting things I find about CNL is it doesn't actually really matter how much you support the nuclear industry or whether you believe there's going to be a future for nuclear as renewables get cheaper and battery storage gets better, because regardless of what happens at the national lab, if it were to shut down tomorrow, there would be a century worth of environmental remediation and decommissioning work to do to restore that land to the state that Canadians would expect us to do. And when I'm think about why I'm most proud to work at CNL, I think of decommissioning and waste management projects like we did at Port Hope and Port Granby. You go to that facility near Darlington in the Durham region, and that was a hugely contaminated town, not just from the uranium refining that happened during the Second World War, although that was a big part of it, but also there was industrial sites that were left in really terrible shape. And the government of Canada reached an agreement with the municipality to clean up those highly polluted sites. And AECL delegated that work to Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. And we have spent years methodically cleaning up these very polluted industrial sites, these radiologically contaminated sites. And now we're at the point where we are giving back the waterfront to that community. We dredged the harbor. We built new parks on formerly industrial sites. That's the kind of work that all of us Canadians can be proud of being done on our behalf by Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. In addition to the exciting science and technology and things like targeted alpha therapy and the next generation of nuclear reactors.
So I still have a little bit of time on the clock.
You have 45 seconds.
Maybe just touch or add on to the Canadian employment numbers. How many Canadian jobs are involved here?
So when we're talking about Canadian Nuclear Laboratories proper, we have about 4,000 employees, and that's spread over Manitoba, New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec. And then if you talk about the companies that make up NLPC, that was awarded the contract to manage Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, we're talking about over 3,000 through BWXT Canada and nearly 1,200 through Kinetrix.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to our witnesses. Some good spirited exchanges there, and which we always welcome, but for the most part respectful. And thank you for appearing today. And colleagues, we are going to roll over into committee business now, which requires we go into Canberra. So we're going to do a quick rollover while. What's that? Yes, I was just about to do that. Yeah. And so we'll suspend for just a few minutes while we get ready to go in.